What if the life you're longing for, something different that feels just out of reach, wasn't just a dream, but a real possibility? What if Jesus' words weren't just ancient wisdom, but a blueprint for a thriving life that stands out from the world around us? The Sermon on the Mount is an invitation to live differently. It's a call from Jesus to move from simply listening to his sermon to living it, allowing his words to shape, challenge, and transform our everyday story. He lays out a practical way to approach prayer, priorities, relationships, anxiety, generosity, and the very foundation on which we build our lives, challenging us to examine not just what we believe, but how those beliefs shape our entire lives. Jesus invites us to choose a new way in a world overwhelmed by anxiety and competition. Together, we'll discover that live different isn't just an ideal, but a real, practical possibility for all who choose to make his sermon our story.
All my life, I've been attracted to the overflow without walls principles and promises and stories in the Bible. One of my all-time favorite prayers in the Bible is Paul's prayer in Ephesians 3, which ends with these words, "Now to God who is able to do exceedingly abundantly beyond all that you ask for or can even imagine." Now, that's a prayer that is so without walls. And the Bible is full of these promises and stories that hint at the possibility of living a life that is without walls. Jesus lived his life without walls, a wow without walls life, a life where just a touch could heal a heart, a life where forgiveness brings freedom and service brings joy, a life where tombs become wombs for second chances. But in so many ways, we live our lives within walls. And we end up disconnected from each other, from God and from life. Sometimes we build walls because I think it seems safe, but really it just ends up being lonely. The All Better book is a book in which elementary school children try to solve some of the more difficult world problems, like what to do about global warming or how to get people to stop smoking. Here's one of the questions these little minds dealt with. With billions of people in the world, someone should be able to figure out a system where no one is lonely. What do you suggest? Kalani, age 8, suggested that someone should find lonely people and ask their name and address, and that ask people who aren't lonely their name and address, and when you have an even amount of each, assign lonely people and not lonely people together in the newspaper. But it was Brian, age 8, who obviously spoke from personal experience when he wrote, "Sing a song, stomp your feet, read a book. Sometimes I think no one loves me, so I do one of these." And aren't we all looking for a connection, seeking community? In fact, I think you could make a really good biblical case that community is exactly what we were most deeply created for. Pastor John Orberg says it like this: I believe if you had to sum up in a single word what God is up to, what his goal is in creating the universe and the people who inhabit it, that word would be, he said, community. This business of community turns out to be something far deeper than just building a successful network of emotional support. It is not simply loneliness avoidance. It is the reason, he writes, it is the reason why we exist. But then we build walls, and too often we end up living behind walls. I mean, isn't that the culture of our times? We live in a time where if you aren't 100% in agreement with me, I'm 100% against you. It's a time of conflict and partisanship, a time when we substitute social media for community, a time when we're quick to judge and write off and build walls instead of bridges. See, I think as we head into this next section of the Sermon on the Mount, I think Jesus' words in Matthew chapter 7, verses 1 through 6 are all about building a life that's without walls. And we understand that's the purpose of judging, right? That's what judging does, right? It builds walls. It separates and divides. It specializes in us versus them. So Jesus says in Matthew chapter 7, verses 1 and 2, "Do not judge, or you too will be judged, for in the same way, with the same measure that you judge others, with the same measure you use, it'll be measured to you." Shortly after Jack Hayford married his wife Anna, he met her family, and he was received warmly by all of her family except for Joe. Joe was running from God, and in the process, he distanced himself from everyone he thought might cramp his lifestyle. Understanding that, Jack decided to do nothing, absolutely nothing that would make Joe feel like he was on a crusade to change his soul. Jack simply chose to accept him as a brother, no matter how Joe lived his life. Jack just wanted to be a friend, but it never worked. It never worked. Time and time again, Jack reached out to Joe in friendship, and time again, Jack was turned away by his uncrackable coolness. And then the turning point came. Jack and Anna traveled back to her parents for their 50th wedding anniversary, and it was a heartwarming family kind of time. But one day that week, Jack was in the backyard trying again to reach out to Joe, and again, Joe rejected him, and it wasn't fair. I mean, Jack's intentions had never been anything but good. Joe's rejections had never been anything but harsh. And at that moment, Jack said, something just snapped inside me, something very observable, even outwardly, yet very real within me snapped. I closed the door. On the spot, Jack said, I simply decided, I'm done. I'm through trying. I gave up on Joe. He wrote him off. He passed judgment. Now, before we go very far at all, we need to set the parameters of this discussion. We need to acknowledge this truth. There is a difference. There's a difference between making a judgment and passing judgment. And we make judgments every day. Life is filled with judgments. We judge whether or not something is good or bad, better or best, right or wrong. And be honest, when that person cut you off in traffic, you made a judgment about whether that was right or wrong. We judge whether or not we have enough gas to make it to our destination. I've misjudged that one a few times. When you decided to come to Calvary instead of a different church in town, you made a judgment. If you leave Calvary, it will be because you made another judgment. Dairy Queen, Myers Dairy, Creamery, got to make a judgment. Or I guess we could visit them all. In the last few weeks, we've made some judgments in our country, right? We've made judgments about the government shutdown and the war in Gaza. We've made judgments about what happened to Charlie Kirk, judgments about Penn State's game against UCLA. But Jesus is not talking about making judgments. He's talking about passing judgment. And there's a difference. Passing judgment means you look beyond what a person says or does. Like you can look into their very heart as though you know them absolutely, as though you can kind of x-ray their soul and then declare them worthy or unworthy. That's passing judgment. And passing judgment builds walls. It separates people and it destroys community. Remember cooties? I don't know. Next generation, maybe you never even had that. For a while when I was a kid, it was what separated the girls from the boys. And after a certain age, cooties was no longer a deal. But when I was a kid, man, in his book, Love Beyond Reason, John Ortberg writes, when I was growing up, the most dreadful childhood disease was neither chicken pox, nor measles, nor mumps. It was a more subtle and mysterious disorder. It was highly contagious. There was no vaccine. There was no antidote, no inoculation. The mere mention of it struck terror in the hearts of my friends and me. The only way to be safe was to place any carriers in strict quarantine. I'm not sure of the medical term he writes, but we called it cooties. All a carrier had to do was to touch you, breathe on you, or even look at you real hard and you'd be infected. It was as if all carriers had a sign that hung from their necks, do not touch. They were the untouchables, right? And it'd be kind of funny if it wasn't for the fact that we never really grew, or at least totally grew out of it. We still have them. Who are our untouchables? I mean, make it personal for a moment. Just take a moment, ask God to bring to mind someone in your life who has received judgment from you. Someone who has become or is becoming an untouchable. Something they did or didn't do or said or didn't say. They hurt you or someone else close to you or for whatever reason, you just feel that they deserve to be written off. You've given up on them, unwilling to see the potential of God at work in their lives. See, passing judgment ignores the good, misses God, and creates untouchables. This is actually one of the big three when it comes to outsiders' negative opinion of the church. One survey indicated that almost 9 out of every 10 next-gen outsiders outside the church believe that being judgmental accurately describes present-day evangelical Christianity. So when you introduce yourself to your 20-something neighbor and at some point let them know that you're a Christian, most likely one of the first words that pop into their mind, at least at some point, is you're probably a judgmental person. You care more about being right than being righteous. You think you're better than me, and you're going to judge my heart long before you ever know my heart. I remember hearing a pastor share about a woman in Atlanta. She grew up in church all her life, and at some point she just felt like too much of her life revolved around what she did at church. She was feeling isolated from people outside the church, so she decided to go get a degree in counseling at a local university. In one class that she had, the students were given this assignment: go and hang out with the people that you are most afraid of. Now, if you were given that assignment, what group would you choose? For her, the answer was the LGBTQ community. That was the group that made her feel anxious. And she realized, you know what? I can't bless people if I'm afraid of them, so I need to go and spend time with them. But here's the part of the story that just kind of struck my heart like a hammer. In that psychology class, the number one answer to the question the group that most people in the class said they were afraid to be around was Christians. 40% of the students in that class, when they were asked, who are you most afraid to hang around with, said people who are Christians. You understand, when we are at our judgmental best, we set ourselves apart and we scare people. And yeah, I know whoever they is, they do it too. Like, we all do it. Rather than a melting pot, our country has become a cause-driven, wall-building nation of partisans, judging the other side without even trying to listen. We have racial divides in red states and blue states. We have pro-life and pro-choice. We have Democrats and Republicans. You know that recent studies suggest that there are fewer inter-party marriages than there are interracial. And it's in the church too. I mean, there's almost 100 varieties of Baptists just in the United States. We have particular Baptists and general Baptists and regular Baptists and actually irregular Baptists. I mean, we all do it. But Jesus said, not in my kingdom. My kingdom will be filled with people who look for the good in others. My kingdom will be filled with people who always hope and never give up and always love. My church will be without walls. My people will embrace, not exclude. That's the question. Do we exclude or do we embrace? Do we build walls or do we build bridges? The culture in Jesus' day was filled with the walls of judgment. Some people were in and some people were out. Jews were in, Gentiles were out. And if you were a Jew, there were still ins and outs. If you were rich, that meant you had God's favor, so you were in. If you were poor, you were out. If you were healthy, you were in. If you had leprosy, my goodness, you were way out. And even if you were a rich, healthy Jewish woman, you were still not quite as in as a poor Jewish man. Do we exclude or embrace? Do we build walls or build bridges? I mean, how long has it been since you went out of your way to be around the friend who betrayed you? Has she become an untouchable to you? If someone here invited you to go with them to do prison ministry, would you go? Would you sit and talk, sit and share the good news of forgiveness to a child abuser? Or how about that person at work? You overheard him last week criticizing you, and it hurt, and now you're avoiding him. How long will he be untouchable? Are there untouchables in your school? What if one of them wanted to sit with you at lunch? Would you? When is the last time you went out to lunch with someone from the other political party? See, the word judgment goes with the word untouchable. In fact, the Greek word for judgment literally means to separate. And it often means to condemn. In fact, the same word is used in John chapter 3, verse 17, when Jesus says, I did not come into the world to condemn the world. So when Jesus says, do not judge, or you too will be judged, what he's saying is, don't write people off. Don't push others out of your life. Don't give up on them. Don't give up hope. Never stop believing in God's ability to redeem. Never stop loving, because in my kingdom, Jesus says, everybody has value. My kingdom is a place where love reigns, and here's the deal, it is hard to love while we're passing judgment. And we can make a judgment about whether a person or a group's actions are right or wrong, but if making judgment leads us to write them off, to devalue them, we've crossed the line from making a judgment to passing judgment. And let's be honest, and we seem to cross that line so easily today. I think it's one of the dangers of social media. We can pass judgment on someone without even seeing the tears in their eyes or the hurt in their heart as we convince ourselves that we don't need to love them. They're unlovable. But what if our job, what if our calling is to agree with God that every person you meet was worth Jesus dying for? and right now in the present moment is loved deeply by Christ? What if I could live my life with Jesus' heart? What if we could build bridges instead of walls? What if we could live different? See, I think we can if we follow Jesus on judging. In Matthew chapter 7, verses 3 and 4, here's what he says. Here's where it starts. Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, let me take the speck out of your eye, when all the time there's a plank in your own eye? So here's Jesus' first words on judging. I need to look in the mirror before I pull out my magnifying glass. Years ago, Millard Fuller of Habitat for Humanity was doing a workshop at a Pittsburgh seminary with about 200 pastors in attendance. And the pastors quickly, kind of in small groups and through their process, they quickly pointed toward greed and selfishness as the reason why the church never had enough money to help others creatively. Fuller then asked this seemingly innocent question. He said, is it possible for a person to build a house so large that it's sinful in the eyes of God? Raise your hand if you think so. 100%. 200 pastors raised their hand. Okay, said Fuller, then can you tell me at exactly what size the precise square footage a certain house becomes too sinful to occupy? There was a pin drop silence that descended on the room, and finally a small, quiet voice spoke up from the back. When it's bigger than mine? I mean, be honest, isn't it easier to set the standards that other people should live by? See, when it comes to judging, we often find ourselves echoing that familiar mantra, love the sinner, hate the sin. I'm really no longer sure that that's a very helpful statement. Maybe love people, hate sin would be better, but do you know what I found? I found it's easier to love the sinner when I hate my own sin. Do you hate your own sin? So what does Jesus say? He says, you hypocrite, first take the plank out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. Don't miss this. It's so important. We've stopped so often at the log in our own eye statement that we miss the next part. See, I think the next part is at the very heart of Jesus' teaching on judgment. First take the plank out of your own eye, and then you'll see clearly to remove the speck in your brother's eye. Did you catch that? Jesus wants us to remove the speck out of each other's eyes. In fact, that word speck is more correctly translated splinter. A splinter in your eye? Man, I know someone who almost lost his eye because of a splinter. See, this is not a live and let live passage. This is not a who are you to say I've got a speck teaching. This is not you deal with your sin, I'll deal with mine, don't bother me kind of suggestion. Jesus is saying, I want you to help your brother. I want you to help your sister. I want you to help your friends get rid of their splinters, but you can't help them with theirs unless you're willing to admit that you've got yours, and that you need just as much help with yours as they do with theirs. See, community is God's plan A for spiritual growth. And in other words, you cannot do it on your own. We can't walk the path that God laid out for us on our own. We have to do it together. Now, I grew up thinking that when it came to heart change, when it came to me becoming more like Jesus, me living different, the ideal way for that to happen was for God to just supernaturally zap me. Like, okay, God, I'm ready. Here I am. I want to live different. Zap my heart. But the longer I live and the more I study the Bible, the more I realize that God's plan A is to use people. You're not going to grow on your own. And when God uses people in your life to help you grow, it's not because He doesn't have time for you. It's because that is the best way. I mean, there's all sorts of reasons why we need community if we want to grow. For example, it's very easy for me to sit alone and convince myself that I'm a pretty humble guy. But when I get in a group and hear someone else receiving the praise, and there's this little voice inside me that is definitely not very humble saying, hey, I'm more than that. Notice me. By myself, all alone, I can convince myself of all the goodness in my heart. But when we commit to community, sooner or later in community, man, we get to the sin issues. And Jesus wants us to get to the sin issues. He wants us to love each other whole. He wants us to be humble enough to ask for help and loving enough to give help. He wants us to love the truth and swim in grace because ultimately He loves us. And you know, I really think that That's the essence of this very odd verse that we come to at the end of this passage in Matthew chapter 7, verse 6, where Jesus says, "Do not give to dogs what is sacred. Do not throw your pearls to pigs. If they do, they may trample them under their feet and then turn and tear you to pieces." Now, this verse is notoriously difficult to interpret. Every commentator that you find seems to have a different idea, but let me simply say this. These words, Jesus' words in verse 6, have the same "if you do it to others, it will happen to you" feel as all the judging verses. So I think Jesus is saying, listen, you guys, this is what happens when we pass judgment on others. When we pass judgment, we're throwing people to the dogs. Actually, I think Jesus is saying we're handing people over to Satan. But people are the prize. Judging writes off and gives over and gives up on the prize. People are sacred. People are a treasure. That's how Jesus sees you. The one with the greatest character, who knows your heart the most intimately, is also the one who loves you with the deepest love. You are his sacred pearls. And so is that person that you've thrown to the dogs. And what Jesus is saying, this is such a hard truth. What he's saying is, listen, what goes around comes around. So, hey, let's live different. Let's be a reflection of Jesus. Let's make it our goal that someday people who know him would say to us, you know what, you remind me a lot of Jesus. Now, remember what John wrote about Jesus in John chapter 3, verses 16 through 17? I want to read it for you from the Message. He said, "This is how much God loved the world. He gave his Son, his one and only Son. And this is why, so that no one need be destroyed. By believing in him, anyone can have a whole and lasting life. God didn't go to the trouble of sending his Son merely to point an accusing finger, telling the world how bad it was. He came to help. He came to put the world right again." Let me close with Jesus' words in Matthew 9, verses 12 and 13. It says, "On hearing this, Jesus said, 'It's not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. But you all go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. For I've not come to call to myself the righteous. I've come to call sinners.'" See, I think Jesus might say, if you want to look more like me, then you need to see others like I do. Go and see others with the eyes of a doctor. Use the eyes of a doctor rather than the eyes of a judge. I mean, let's just suppose that on your way to work each morning, you usually stop at Starbucks and you tend to get to the store at about the same time each morning. You usually see this young, I don't know, maybe a Penn State student who gets there about the same time that you do. In fact, more than once, you found yourself standing next to her in line. And you remember her because she ordered the same thing as you, quad espresso with 1 pack of raw sugar. She's not like you. In fact, you're not even sure what her pronouns might be. She's got pride rainbows all over her backpack. She doesn't make eye contact with others. You wonder whether you should strike up a conversation with her, maybe offer to hold her backpack while she pays. You're just not sure what to do, what to say. In fact, it's kind of easy for you to pass judgment, but then you remember the pastor told you not to do that, but you're really not sure what to do. Try to be friendly. Let her notice that you remember her. Ask a question about her life. And then that question comes into your mind, what would Jesus do? Well, Jesus would move into her world. Maybe make a comment about quad espressos and those coffee rookies who order caramel, non-whip, macchiato, double drip lattes with skim milk. Probably offer to hold her backpack while she pays. And over time, he would tell her his name. If she missed a few days, tell her that he hopes she wasn't sick the next time he sees her. Why would he move into her world? Because with the eyes of a doctor, he sees the hurts that God can heal. He sees the walls of alienation and mistrust that God can tear down. He sees the disease of junk done to her and by her that God can redeem. He doesn't write her off. He doesn't pass judgment on her heart. He loves her. He sees her as someone who is loved by God, as someone for whom he is willing at that moment on the spot to die. And you can repeat that story over and over again. The guy at work that everyone shakes their head at, the deadbeat dad, the woman hooked on heroin who can't care for her kid, the angry complainer at work, the parent in the neighborhood who thinks their kid is perfect and your kid is always at fault, the homeless lady, the guys on that softball team that get drunk and say lewd things about the ladies in the stands, that person on Facebook who is anti-everything that you hold dear. Jesus sees them all with the eyes of a doctor, not a judge. So he moves into their world and he calls us to follow him so that we can see the kingdom of God at work, healing hurts and redeeming sin and bringing freedom to those who are locked up by their past. He sees the insecurities behind the macho facade and the loneliness and the vulnerability behind the anger. He sees with the eyes of a doctor, not a judge, and he calls us to move into their world. And that's what a church without walls does. So last question. What if we build a church without walls, filled with people living life without walls? Let me just finish Jack Hayford's story of Joe, the brother-in-law that he gave up on. Summer and autumn passed that year, and then on an overcast Valentine's Day, Jack strolled into the kitchen, and there was this open Valentine card laying on the table. It caught his eyes. He flipped it open, and having read the front of the card, he was looking for the expected punchline, but instead, God directed his eyes toward what was written by the sender. It was a card from Joe's daughter to Jack's daughter. And the words read, "Dear Becky, I just wanted to add a note to thank you for mentioning in your last letter that you regularly pray for my dad to come to Jesus." And Jack says that at that moment, God drove home two things in his heart. Number one, how much God loved Joe. And number two, the audacity that he had had to ever give up on Joe. And at that moment, Jack knelt there on the kitchen floor, asked God to forgive him for giving up, and for the first time, he prayed for Joe. That August, a few months later, on a Sunday night, as everyone was getting ready for bed, Jack got a phone call. It was Joe. "Jack, Anna," he said, I just wanted to call you both tonight because I felt that you both would want to be among the first to know. I came to the Lord today. I gave my life to Jesus." You understand, that's what God does when we live our lives without walls, building a church without walls. Father, would you forgive me, forgive us for the times when we pass judgment, when we give up on people and we kind of assign them to conviction and condemnation, when we push them out of our lives, when we build walls. And God, would you help us to be a people who live life without walls, who build a church without walls, so that all people would know how much you love them. God, let your love flow through us. Let us become a people that at some point in our life somebody says, you remind me a lot of Jesus. May that be the goal for each and every one of us. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.